Senator Ananda-Rajah.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Whish-Wilson, you are a fierce advocate for the environment and particularly the marine environment. And you're a great person, and I know this is, a topic that is so close to your heart. It is so close to the heart of so many Australians, including people in this chamber, certainly people in the government. The government will not be supporting this bill. However, we recognise the problems that we have with plastic. We are drowning in plastic. And I'm going to wear my environmental hat and I'm going to wear my medical hat. I was recently on the Community Affairs Microplastics Inquiry, and I heard some truly sobering and alarming testimony, and I did my own personal research. With respect to plastics, we are in the midst of a pandemic of plastic. And with regards to microplastics and nanoplastics, they are ubiquitous. They are all over the environment. When you go looking for them, you will find them. They're in the soil, they're in the air that we breathe, they're in the clothes that we wear, polyester, it's a plastics, derived from plastics. Our foods are wrapped in plastic. And when you go looking in the human body, you actually find plastic, microplastics, in every single organ of the body and in our fluids. It's in the brain, it's in the placenta, it's in the lungs, the heart, the musculature, it's in semen. In terms of the health problems that are associated with microplastics, nanoplastics, it's linked to a litany of problems from in utero all the way to adulthood, childhood and adulthood. And this has been probably best studied by the Minderoo Foundation, who have recently published a paper in Nature this year, March of this year. But Minderoo have done a power of work, and we heard testimony from Minderoo and scientists and medical specialists. These microplastics, or plastics in general, have about 16,000 chemicals. The chemicals are loosely bound to a polymer matrix. In other words, once these are ingested into the body, the chemicals can leach out into the body. And it's that leaching out which causes problems. And it's not just PFAS, folks. It's 16,000 chemicals. Most of these chemicals, we don't really understand what they do to the body. But we've got some clues. We know that these are endocrine disruptors, right? So they damage the endocrine system, which, by the way, our endocrine system means tiny, tiny chemical amounts of hormones that make our body function, right? So you have something in there that disrupts the hormonal axis. It leads to all kinds of knock-on effects. One of them is infertility. We heard testimony that in the last 30 years, IVF success rates in Australia have not shifted. Okay, so we spend billions on in vitro fertilization, but success rates have not shifted. Why? Why? Has it something to do with microplastics and their transmission across the placenta in what was termed by a Minderoo expert as toxic trespass, that these chemicals are crossing the placenta and may in some way be then harming the growing fetus. And if I read out the list, you will all be in the fetal position. And I'm going to read out some of the harms. In utero, miscarriage, preterm birth, low birth weight, small head size, genital malformation, asthma, wheeze, bronchitis, childhood, ADHD, autism, obesity, asthma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a whole litany of problems as long as my arm. In adulthood, that list gets even bigger. Linked to endometriosis, uterine fibroids, sperm concentration and quality problems, diabetes, PCOS, insulin-resistant type 2 diabetes, and it goes on and on and on. Linked, not necessarily causal, but linked. What was also alarming from this study is that, from this inquiry that we did, was that we heard testimony that big oil is planning on increasing plastic production. In fact, this was in The Lancet. It was published in The Lancet last year. Lancet Commission Countdown on Health and Plastics, a weighty document, and there was one passage that jumped out at me, and it basically said that the Saudi Arabian oil company plans to channel about 1/3 of its oil production to plastics and petrochemicals by 2030. They are pivoting. They're pivoting away from oil and, fuel to plastic production. They're looking for another market. And what is driving this is single-use plastics, overwhelmingly single-use plastics. So we've got to get ahead of this. One thing that was evident also was that we had a really good discussion with the CEO of the Australian Council of Recycling, and I'm going to read out from Hansard, the 20th of March this year. And this was her view with regards to the extended producer responsibility scheme, which has been operating in Europe for decades. But the problem is that even, and I quote, even in Europe, over the last 18 months or so, they've lost about 1 million tonnes of processing capacity for recycled plastic because the demand for the product hasn't been out there and you can buy it much more cheaply offshore. So whilst we really need an EPR for packaging, and by the way, for most manufactured products, we also need to see much stronger procurement drivers to make sure that what we remake here has a market and we can keep that system viable. In other words, when you talk about plastic, and she laid it out for us, you're talking about three components: collection, processing, and then markets. And where this has fallen down in Europe is in the market side. And because there hasn't been a market for recycled plastic, it has meant that they've got an overcapacity and plants have shut down. And they've lost 1 million tonnes of recycling capacity. That's in Hansard. So the reason that is of course because recycled plastic is more expensive than virgin plastic. And this is why Saudi Arabian oil wants to churn out more plastic. It's going to make them money, right? But it's our job as a government and as a parliament to figure out a holistic approach to this that will ensure that it actually works and we land this. And that means that we have to collaborate and consult widely with industry, with the states and territories as well, because they collect these items. It's not as easy as just pulling one single lever and saying job done and calling it the EPR and saying job done, because we've seen in Europe, their own history has shown that without the market signals to procure this recycled plastic at a higher cost, the whole system can fall over. In terms of Australia's response, look, we should be incredibly proud of the advocacy led by former Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek and now Minister Murray Watt. Within a few months of forming government in 2022, so in November of 2022, Australia joined the High Ambition Coalition to end plastic pollution. This is a coalition of over 100 countries from all continents around the world. There is a recognition around the world that we have a pandemic of plastic. And actually we heard testimony during this inquiry that Australia is relatively, quote-unquote, clean when it comes to plastic, which tells you that automatically it is much, much worse elsewhere. In the Pacific Islands, in Southeast Asia, there are rivers literally clogged with plastic. So we have to work globally to reduce the supply of plastic, right, at its source. And to that end, Australia also supported, and we were very vocal in wanting the Global Plastics Treaty to pass. Very vocal, staunch supporters of this measure. But unfortunately, talks broke down in August of last year. And it was kiboshed by the big petrostates, Saudi Arabia, the US and Kuwait. No surprise there. No surprise there. Had that plastics treaty actually passed, it would have led, and this is the nub of it. It's not just about recycling, folks. Recycling doesn't fix this problem. It's about actually committing to reducing plastic production and putting in restrictions. And then, in allowing that to happen, you then create space for alternatives. Bioplastics, for example. Plastics that are derived, or plastic-like materials that are derived from seaweed. And other types of biodegradable materials. And as a committee, we also saw evidence from scientists here in Australia who are developing these kinds of materials. They are already there. They need a market. They need to have space created so that these alternatives can be used by Australians, by businesses, by hospitals, huge producers of plastic waste around the country. But they're crowded out because virgin plastic is so cheap. So we've got to get to the source, and that will require, I think, global cooperation and countries standing up to these big petrostates and fossil fuel interests. And Australia has, we've nailed our colours to the mast in that regard. We want this to pass, and we're going to have to work now in alternative channels to figure out a way we can land this global plastics treaty. But talking about this problem is part of the solution. Mobilising Australians, mobilising the global community to back this kind of treaty is incredibly important. And that's why I thank you for your sustained advocacy in this space. I know this will disappoint you that we're not going to support this bill, but understand that we get it. We get the problems here. But we want to work in a collaborative way in order to land a solution that will actually have teeth and be effective, and will not just deal with plastic recycling, which is not, and that should really be the take-home message. It's not the full solution. It's about stopping this at its source, calling out those fossil fuel interests who are looking for new markets. And that's going to take a global effort. I might stop there, Chair. Thank you.